So, Shaun, we're going to talk about the defense next. And as I said, this is going to be a little bit shorter segment. Number one, we went long on the offensive segment, which I kind of anticipated. But the second part is, I think this one is a lot simpler to discuss. I think the conversation about the Notre Dame defense is much. I don't think there's as much debate about where they are. I think if there was some debate, it's like, can they maintain? And I think overall, defensively, there's no doubt that Notre Dame has closed the gap on defense as a whole based on what we've seen in recent seasons. And it's not even just the last 2 years under Al Golden. They made the championship run in 2012 because of their defense. They made the championship run in 2018, the playoff run in 2018 because of their defense. In 2020, a lot of it was because of their defense. You look at their defense in 2021 under Marcus Freeman. People talk about, well, that 21 team played way better late in the year. And I'm like, well, A, they played bad teams, and B, because the defense finally got going. And then, of course, the last 2 years, the 24 wins of the last 2 years is primarily driven by the defense. So the question now is, okay, can they maintain it? And at the end of the day, we don't know. And that's why there's really not a conversation to be really had right now. We can say they had closed the gap coming into this offseason. We're going to have to find out if Chris Ash can keep it going. I mean, there's not a whole lot else to say besides that. The gap has been closed as a defense. Are there certain areas they can improve? Yeah, the run defense can get a little better here, but the reality is the end result is the last 2 years, you're a top 5 scoring defense. Gap closed. I don't know what else you want me to say. They were 4th in scoring defense this year. They were 7th in scoring defense last year, 0.3 behind the number 5 team, Georgia. You know, if you look at, a lot of the different metrics and different aspects of their scoring defense, they've been an outstanding scoring defense in the last 2 years. Elite pass defense the last 2 years. I mean, just outstanding pass defense the last couple of years. And for the most part, played pretty well in big games. I mean, you didn't lose the Ohio State game because of the defense until the final drive, right? Yeah, we talked about that. Even with the mistake we talked about in the Ohio State game in 2022, they gave up 21 freaking points to Ohio State. That Ohio State team who later in the year scored 40-something on the Georgia team we were talking about, right? I mean, you look at not always, but in most games, the defense did what they needed to do. The gap's closed. Say, yeah, but they gave up this amount to Penn. Well, look what Penn State gave up to them. Look what Notre Dame's defense did or offense did to Ohio State in the second half of that game with the starters in the game. You know, I mean, it's not like they pulled the starters out. So the question then is, okay, can they continue? And honestly, Shaun, we've talked a lot about it. We'll talk more about it. We're going to get specifically into the position groups, but I just want to give you a chance to just kind of quickly talk about this. But I think the question is simple. The answer is simple. Notre Dame closed the gap on defense. There's confidence that I have that it will continue because of Marcus Freeman. But at the end of the day, we don't know. We're going to have to see how the season plays out. But talent-wise, recruiting-wise, and play on the field the last 2 years-wise, this team has closed. The gap is closed. They're on the elite level with other teams. The only question now moving forward is, can they keep it from a coaching standpoint? No question the talent's going to remain there. Yeah. The question is the coaching going to be good enough at the coordinator level? And I'm not saying it is. I'm not saying it isn't. I'm saying anytime you get a new coach, that's always going to be the question. It's the question we had when Al Golden got hired. It's the question when Marcus Freeman got hired. Could he build on what Clark Lee did? That was the question when Clark Lee got hired. Could he build on what Mike Elko established? And that's kind of been the key. Outside of one bad hire at defensive coordinator in the last 15 years, Notre Dame's been coached very well on defense outside of the 3 years under Bryan Van Gorder. Bob Diaco was a darn good defensive coordinator at Notre Dame. Mike Elko did a phenomenal job turning that team around, and Clark Lee did a great job building on it. Marcus Freeman was outstanding in his one season as defensive coordinator, and Al Golden did a phenomenal job, just ended his career at Notre Dame with winning the Broyles Award as the best in college football. Gap closed. Now we just got to see if they can stay there moving forward.
Yeah, the gap has considerably been closed. I think what you talk about, there's been a consistent, solid defensive mindset at Notre Dame for a long time. Just solid. Marcus Freeman had the audacity to come in and say, the guys that the previous regime felt like they couldn't go get, we can go get on the defensive side of the ball. And we already referenced what Mike Mickens did, the situation that he had when he came in. That secondary was, usually known as the weak link of the Notre Dame defense, especially when they went up against elite offenses. They changed that perception in a short time. You talk about the linebackers. They got longer. They got more athletic. Marcus Freeman said that when he was defensive coordinator, he came in and immediately wanted to change that. And he changed that with his first linebacker class and recruiting. And he's continued to do that. And I think they've even improved year by year. They seem to find that one difference maker in the linebacker room. And now they've taken to the next step where it's like, now we're stacked in this linebacker room. And so now the next step is, I hear people like, oh, what about the interior of the defensive line? And one thing you could say about the defensive line last year, we don't have to get into it too deep, and we'll get into the positions, but on each level, they're starting to recruit guys. I think Bryce Young is a difference maker and a game breaker. I think Chris Burgess Jr. has the same potential coming in the 25 class. I think the 26 class, we'll talk about it. I think they have guys that can fit that mold. Now, do they have it in multiples like some other big time programs?
Let me ask you a question, Shaun. It's real simple. How many All-Americans did the linebackers produce the last 2 years?
0.
How many All-Americans did the defense produce the last 2 years?
1. Yeah.
1. How many All-Americans did the defensive line produce the last 2 years? 2.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, so some of this is just Notre Dame fans still buying into the narrative of oh, Notre Dame isn't this or isn't that because of whatever. Now, moving forward, there's legitimate questions, and we'll get into those.
Right.
But you didn't win in spite of, like, somebody the other day was like, well, yeah, I mean, Notre Dame's defensive line wasn't that good. What makes you say that? Well, look what happened against Penn State and Ohio State. Well, shouldn't have Ohio State done that, considering Notre Dame's 2 All-Americans I just mentioned weren't really playing? I know Howard Cross played. That's not the Howard Cross we saw the last 2 years. That was a kid who was only playing because you had you lost Jason Onye, you lost Riley Mills. I mean, say what you want, but when you have basically 4 starters either out or hobbled, you're not going to look phenomenal in the championship game. So I just feel like that's a narrative that's not necessarily backed by facts of what we have seen the last 2 years. I mean, I literally saw somebody the other day talk about the D-line on our message board today, how Notre Dame's defensive line wasn't really that good the last 2 years. I'm like, man, we're watching a different football team. I have no clue what you're talking about. I mean, yeah, but they don't have guys like Georgia. Hold on a second. Who was more dominant of the other team's offensive line in the Sugar Bowl? Notre Dame's defensive line against Georgia without Riley Mills, or Georgia's defensive line against Notre Dame's? That's an easy answer. Notre Dame's defensive line in front 7 was far more dominant against Georgia. They could do nothing in that game against Notre Dame. So I just kind of – now, do they have the NFL prospects Georgia has? No.
Yeah.
But look, I get some people don't like Al Washington. I understand that. But, like, it's one thing to say, hey, guys got to recruit better. It's nothing to just ignore the job that he did coaching this year just so we can bang on him.
It's a really good job.
We're not going to do that. Coach. We're not going to do that. So, but just overall as a defense, I think we can say that the gap has been closed. And we'll transition to the position group, Shaun, by talking about the linebacker play. Because it's actually interesting. I think the play at linebacker the last 2 years has been outstanding. What we're now starting to see in 24 and beyond is now the talent level is going up a notch. Now, they weren't playing with stiffs the last couple of years because J.D. Bertrand and Maris Leofau were both drafted in the NFL. They were clearly NFL talents to some varying degree. Moving forward, though, as you mentioned, Shaun, Marcus Freeman, we're seeing the fruits of Marcus Freeman's labor, so to speak, at linebacker as much as any position because of, like you mentioned, that focus on we got to get longer, we got to get faster. And I think the linebacker room and the younger classes, basically from 22 on, shows that, because let's not forget that Notre Dame's 2 starting defensive ends basically in the postseason were guys Marcus Freeman recruited to play linebacker, and Junior Tillamook and Josh Burnham. So linebacker has impacted a lot of positions since Marcus Freeman got here. And moving forward, it's hard not to be really excited about that. I don't to me, that gap is closed. And any questions you had should have been answered in the playoffs, because we had to watch how they would play in the same game of watching Georgia's guys.
Yeah.
You know, we got to watch Notre Dame's linebackers be every bit as athletic as the Georgia linebackers. We got to watch them against Ohio State. We got to watch them against Penn State. And you can say, yeah, some things got to improve, execution, things like that. But when you talk about quality of athlete, quality of talent, length, Notre Dame's young group takes a back seat to nobody at linebacker.
Even more than that, you mentioned Josh and Junior. That just speaks to the level of the recruitment, that you can have really high-rated guys at the position come in, and now you say to yourself, man, we got to find a way to get these guys on the field, because we don't see a path possibly for them at this position, not just because of what we have, but because of what we're going to continue to bring in. And then for them to produce, you know, like you said, they were the starters in the playoffs, but to start the season, they were backups. They were your reserves. And that just speaks to, once again, the job that the defensive line coach did in coaching those guys and developing those guys. But I just really think the one thing that improved off the bat was open field tackling, by the linebacker position getting more athletic and longer. You saw that, right? And definitely you saw improvement in the tackle for losses. You know, for years we would see linebackers have opportunities to make those plays, and they didn't make the plays. Now, you know, you see a kid, whether it's Drake Bowen, I think Jaden Osbury struggled a little bit in the Penn State game, having opportunities to make, you know, tackles for losses and tackles in open space. But
yeah, that
he
6'6" tight end hurt him a little bit.
With the stiff arm, yeah.
But you're not facing that guy very often. That's a unicorn.
No. But other than that, you know, I think we didn't even get to see Kingston, because of injury late in the season, really play at his high level in the playoffs. So I think it's going to be definitely something that I think the linebacker play is going to be probably the best it's been this year.
I think so.
And in a long time.
No shot at Jack Kaiser. It's more about the Jack was the veteran with a bunch of puppies, and Jack's leadership was a big reason why I think a lot of the young guys played as well as they did.
Yeah.
But now that they're becoming juniors and sophomores, and I mean, I'll be shocked if Drake Bowen's not a team captain this year. Shocked.
Yeah.
You know, you got Jaden Osbury is tied for second. He doesn't even start. Did he start a single game this year? I don't think he did. And he's tied for second on your defense and tackles for loss. You know, Kingston, what he did. Jalen Sneed kind of popping late in the year. And then you add Madden Faremo and Anthony Sacca. You've got Bodie Cahoon. You've got Teddy Rizak. Like, you're deep, you're athletic, to the point where I'm like, please move Preston Zinter somewhere else. For the love of all things holy, please give that kid a chance to play somewhere. He's not going to play a linebacker. It's too deep. It's too talented. In 2020, Preston Zinter's at the very least a rotation linebacker on that defense. At the very least.
Yeah.
If not eventually starter, meaning like a sophomore, junior version of Preston Zinter.
Yeah.
But on this team, it's just too loaded. And recruiting is, I mean, I just go read the breakdown I did. There's talented kids that they're on again in 2026. So linebacker, no-brainer. Cornerback's another one, Shaun. It's a no-brainer for me with what Notre Dame has done. They've closed the gap. The gap's closed. They're on that level. Yeah. And the reason I say that is because it's not just because, like, 2018, they had a great cornerback tandem. But that was unique to that team because it was those two. Once Julian Love left, they weren't as good the next year. And once Troy left, they went from really good in 18 to there was a major weakness in 2020 quickly, because it was all built around two guys. And you hadn't recruited well enough to, once those guys were gone, that you were okay. Yeah. Notre Dame lost Cam Hart and didn't miss a beat at cornerback to start the season. Then you lose Benjamin Morrison, and you're not quite as good as a unit, but you're still outstanding, and you go on a title run with Benjamin Morrison playing 6 out of the 16 games. And then, by the way, what are you bringing in next year? Maybe the best cornerback class you've had yet. Carson Hobbs is an ascending player, 6'1", fast, athletic, and he's getting coached by Mike Mickens. You're bringing in a cornerback class of Dallas Golden, Mark Zachary, and Cree Thomas, which is elite, in my opinion. So, and you've got an elite coach. So there's no doubt that the cornerback room is as good. Yeah, but what about that play against Jeremiah Smith? Okay, everyone is going to give up plays to Jeremiah Smith. He's the most physically gifted receiver in the country. Right? This is a room that as a whole is on that level. They are an elite room. There's no question. I mean, that's an easy no-brainer one for me.
I think
coaching and talent.
Yeah. And I'm excited because I think what we heard about Tate before he was sidelined with injury, the way he was coming on, and then you see a flash from like a Kenny. They did a really good job. And this is what I love about Mike Mickens. They just find ways to give their youngsters in-game opportunities. Like you saw a Luke Talmadge make plays to pick six. You saw Kenny Urlacher against Purdue make a lot of big hits. Like they just find opportunities to get their guys in there, right? And then because of that, when the opportunity comes where they get a chance for more action, they're ready. And so I have full confidence. I love the additions that they've made, at the nickel specifically. I think that's a great addition. So you talking about having an elite pass defense. I think that trend continues because I expect Christian Gray to get better. I think he's going to get better. He's going to become technically better at the position. It's his first year starting. I guess people forget that.
He's still pretty good.
He's still pretty good.
I mean, can we not remember some of the big plays he made early in the year and
once
against
again,
Penn State?
He was better prior to injury than he was post-injury. Leonard Moore, stud. I think the last 2 years, the way everyone has come after the defensive backs at Notre Dame, other programs have come after them aggressively, speaks to how people view the Notre Dame cornerback.
SEC schools, multiple SEC schools have thrown seven-figure deals at multiple Notre Dame cornerbacks.
Multiple Notre Dame cornerbacks. Yes.
Yeah. Not just one.
Yep.
3 of them. So, yeah. I feel like most college football fans and coaches understand how good Christian Gray and Leonard Moore were, even though some Notre Dame fans don't necessarily agree how good Christian Gray is, because that's just how fans are. It's just sad truth of it. But cornerback room is there, Shaun. That's a no-brainer for me. And then the other one for me, which I think is a little bit more debatable for the future, but I think safety. It's hard for me to argue that Notre Dame for me to accept an argument that says Notre Dame's not in the top world of college football when it comes to safety play. I mean, the last decade plus, you've produced Harrison Smith, you've produced Kyle Hamilton, Xavier Watts, Alohi Gilman, Jalen Elliott. I mean, you've had some outstanding safeties over the years, and your performance as a position group has been very good. Yeah. The 18 team, everybody talks about how good the corners were, but sometimes we forget how good Alohi Gilman and Jalen Elliott were that season. And you add Kyle Hamilton to that in 19, and then in 2020, how good Kyle Hamilton was playing the cornerback position with Sean Crawford. And then, obviously 2021, you end up moving Xavier Watts there. Doesn't necessarily pay huge dividends that year, but then 22, 23, and 24, you start to see Xavier Watts become a dude. And the recruiting has been a lot stronger in recent seasons too. You landed a Don Schuler. You got Bronte Johnson. You got Kennedy Urlacher, who I like a lot. You're bringing in Jadon Blair this year, who's a dude. You're bringing in Ethan Long and Brandon Logan and guys like that. I think corner safety recruiting, I don't know if I'd say it's quite as strong as corner, but it's been pretty good. But the thing is, Mike Mickens is targeting different type of player at safety than he is at corner. And I think he puts an even greater premium on this at safety, even more so than he does corner. It's important at corner, but it's even more so at safety. And then, of course, they've done well in the portal the last couple of years, recruiting that position as well. So I think that's a position group. And then if you look at the secondary as a whole, I think when you've had a top 5 pass defense for 2 years in a row, you've produced All-Americans and freshman All-American and a 2-time consensus, once unanimous, once a consensus safety. Don Schuler is just a guy that people are just assuming is going to pick up where Xavier Watts left off. And go be that dude, and that's an easy one for me. Corner safety equals secondary. It's an easy one for me. They're already in that upper echelon of 5, 6, 7 programs that are as good as anybody else when it comes to the secondary.
Yeah. And I think Mike Mickens, who primarily recruited the cornerbacks, I think now is really getting his footing when it comes to safety recruiting as well. Getting Jadon Blair was absolutely amazing. I mean, he is just a kid. I mean, honestly, if I'm not mistaken, the kid was playing wide receiver doing bowl prep. I was hearing he was taking snaps for wide receiver with the scout team. So
because his size and speed was just going to give them a different look that they.
So that's what you're working with, right? And so now I'm interested in. You talked about the evolution of one, Don Shula. I'm very interested in seeing what else they put on his plate. You know, because I think Adon, it was a blessing to play next to Xavier Watts for that 1 year. It was a blessing. I think he absorbed a lot from him. And I think, you know, you're going to see his game evolve. I think he's going to be asked to do a little bit more, and he's very capable of playing at a high level, even when things are added to his plate. But it's going to be interesting to see who plays next to him. It's just really going to be interesting. I think you're going to see Jadon Blair, you know, get opportunities, even if he's not the starter. They're going to find a way to get him on the field because, like I said, Mike Mickens just finds a way to get his young, talented players opportunities, you know, to get themselves ready for big time action. So I'm actually excited about the safety position. Of course, the portal, you know, just with the nickel, they did a great job in the portal, you know, going out and getting a really
3 years in a row
good player 3 years in a row. So, yeah, I agree with you. Safety is a position that's only getting better, right? And it's the Xavier Watts. He continues that trend. I think maybe it was last year. It was like two of the top 5 safeties and 3 of the top 10 in the NFL with Notre Dame safeties.
Yeah, because Julian Love, right? Would he count as one?
Julian
Harrison,
Love,
Kyle Hamilton, Julian.
Harrison, Kyle Hamilton, and that's Aloy.
And Aloy Gilman starting for the Chargers, from what I believe I saw.
Yeah.
You know. I think they're there. So what about the positions where they're not there, Shaun? And really there's 2, and it's both defensive line positions. I would argue that they're not there. Yeah. And the reason I would say we're talking about gap close. This is it doesn't mean gaps close or you sucked.
Yeah.
That's where I think a lot of this conversation frustrates the crap out of me. You can say that Notre Dame did not have an elite defensive line this year. They didn't, without making it seem like they were winning in spite of the D-line, which is utter nonsense, especially when you consider how they performed without their starters. And when you look at that Georgia game, especially. But I think the question is, where are they moving forward? And what we're going to learn over the next couple of years was Notre Dame really good at D-tackle the last couple of years for the same reason they were good at corner in 2018? Because they just happened to have 2 really good players, but the foundation wasn't strong enough to when those guys left, the next in line kind of came through like we're seeing at corner now, where you can lose a Cam Hart, no big deal. Christian Gray steps in. You can lose a Benjamin Morrison. You're able to survive because Leonard Moore steps in. And then Carson Hobbs now steps into the 2 deep. And then you were bringing Dallas Golden and Mark Zachary and Cree Thomas. And you're just like, man, that train's just rolling, brother. It's rolling. I think that's a very fair question of defensive line because we haven't seen it. And I have some doubts about can Notre Dame continue playing the way it did without those guys? Because the reality is when Howard Cross got hurt and when Riley Mills got hurt, the defensive line was not as good. And noticeably so, where that's not a knock on Notre Dame because that's true for most teams, but that's what separates you from being good and being elite. The elite teams can lose a guy and say, hey, we're going to be all right. You know, Ohio State could lose a Emeka Egbuka or Jeremiah Smith for a game, and you're like, I guess we're going to have to put Brandon Ennis in the starting lineup and focus more on throwing to Cardinal Tate. Gee, how are we going to survive? They're going to be just fine. I mean, that's when you're elite. And that's not where I think they were on the D-line or at D-tackle. But even at defensive end, the talent is really impressive. And I'll give you a chance to speak on that because we did a show on that last week. So I'll let you speak on that. I think the talent they're closing the gap with edge talent. they're not there from edge performance yet. And I don't think the gap is even closed yet on edge talent, but they're definitely closing it. Defensive tackle's a bigger question for me from a recruiting and development standpoint, be after what you lost this year. I'm not saying it is a problem. I'm saying it's a question mark simply because everyone's being thrust into a role they've never had to perform in yet. And how are they going to handle that? And can they perform at a level that, because like the D tackle line, I had somebody tell me 2 nights ago that if you look at statistics, Notre Dame's they had the most sacks of any interior defensive tackle room in college football. I don't know if that's true or not for number one, but they were definitely in the top group. Now, a lot of Notre Dame fans may not register with a lot of Notre Dame fans, but that is facts. When you look at the production of Riley Mills, you look who had 6.5 sacks this past season. Howard Cross had let's pull up. So Riley led the team in sacks with 6.5 or 7.5. Excuse me. Your number 2 leader in sacks was Donovan Heinisch at 4.5. That's 12 from your D tackles. Howard Cross is third on your defense with 4 sacks. That's 16 sacks from just that group of 3. Jason Onye had 1.5. Gabriel Rubio had 1. That's almost 20 sacks from your D tackles. That's pretty flipping good. Now, the question is, but can you keep that going now that Riley Mills and Howard Cross take their 11.5 of those sacks in All-American seasons out? That's a very fair question that Notre Dame fans have. My issue is more that they don't give credit for how good the D-line was. We can all question, will it continue? That's fair. They have to prove it. But it was very good this year, especially when when you look at when they finally started getting healthy. When, like, early in the year, Riley and Howard weren't playing well, but by Louisville on, Riley Mills was playing phenomenal football. And Howard Cross was playing a lot better too until the injury against Florida State. So I think it's good, Shaun, but I don't think you can argue that their defensive line as a whole is elite. Because even this year, defensive end play was more productive than it was the year before, but it hasn't been a great unit in the last couple of years. I mean, Isaiah Foskey in 21 was really good. Isaiah's numbers in 22 were good, but I don't think he was as dominant in 2022 as he was in 2021. It's been a really good D-line, but it hasn't been an elite D-line. And if it's not elite, you haven't closed the gap. It got closer, but now with those guys gone, the question now becomes, Shaun, can they be elite? Can they be, how close are they to closing the gap on the D-line as a whole, but then also at edge and tackle? And if you don't mind starting off with the edge, I really want to get your opinion on where you see it, because Trev and I talked about this last week. I want to get your thoughts on where you think the defensive end position is, like, now moving forward. We all know what it was. We've talked a lot about that, but now moving forward, what's your view on where the defensive
once again,
end position is?
You have to admit that the talent at the defensive end position has vastly improved just from projecting and what they're going to be able to do. With that being said, I think the interesting aspect, and I'm not going to sit here and debate whether or not, you pointed out the stats. You had 2 players on the inside that opposing offenses had to identify, which allowed the edges. And we saw, but Jordan Botelho and Boubacar before injury benefit from a lot of one-on-ones, and they made the plays. And the reason they had those one-on-ones is because there was a lot of attention given to the 2 interior tackles for Notre Dame. Now that those tackles are gone, how our offense is going to go ahead and play this Notre Dame defensive line? It's going to be very interesting, because now you have a lot of depth at defensive end, assuming that Traore comes back, Bryce Young, Logan Thomas, Burgess Jr., some of the other guys you have that are developing. It's going to be very interesting. You mentioned Jordan Botelho. So it's going to be very interesting to see that, with a lot of the eyes probably going outside now until the interior, Jason Onye, Heinisch, Rubio, and some of the other youngsters like a Devin Houston, Brennan Vernon, and Armel Mukum, until they show who they are to opposing offenses, now it's going to be eyes on the exterior, the defensive ends, to see if they can apply pressure, right? And that was one of the things that really helped out Josh Burnham, in my opinion, and Junior Tuihalamaka is that they had one-on-ones. RJ Oben, disappointing until he got to the playoffs. He had one-on-ones all year and just wasn't able to get it done. Now, and that was in spite of that, of course, with the blitzes. I really don't think the blitzes, especially in the playoffs, were as effective as they were in the regular season against good teams. And we saw that against Ohio State. No need to go into that any further. But I really think the talent on the defensive end is, I think I would love to have seen this group of defensive ends with those tackles commanding attention as they have maturing. I would love to see them get the same one-on-ones in their second year of college football. Unfortunately, that's not going to be the case. So it's going to be interesting to see the development of that interior of the defensive line, to see whether or not they garner eventually the same amount or similar amount of attention that Riley Mills and Howard Cross were able to garner, which I don't think they're going to do it in year one, but definitely going into year two as they, guys like Jason Onye, this is a good kid that's basically, this is your last shot. So do you come out with the same fire that a Jordan Patello came out with last year under the same thing? Like, this is my last shot.
Same with Rubio. This is his last shot.
This is his last shot. So you have guys that might have that fire on the interior that might end up, making an impact. Of course, the Louisville transfer is going to be impactful because he rushes the passer. That's one of the things he does very well, even at his side. So it's going to be interesting. I don't think they take as much of a step back because I just think they have a lot collectively across that defensive line that's going to allow them to produce at a really high level. And like I said, what they got from Jean Baptiste, what they got from him, they didn't replicate that with RJ Oben. And I think maybe that was the disappointment. But, I think this was the last year where they really, from the edge standpoint, they were like, well, we're good.
I heard their name mentioned with almost nobody at defensive end in this portal cycle.
Absolutely.
Now, you can maybe say, hey, maybe they should have or shouldn't have, but they didn't. I mean, there wasn't anybody.
Yeah. So as far as defensive line, from a recruiting standpoint, defensive line, and you and I love the two, man, the Vipers.
Yeah.
And the 26 class that they're going after.
Yeah.
Man.
Well, and then, Logan Thomas, I think, has a ton. I mean, it's been a long time since you could look at Notre Dame and say they had just the God-given physical tools on the edge like they're going to have the next couple of years with Boubacar, Bryce Young, Logan Thomas, Josh Burnham, Junior Tuihalamaka, Chris Burgess, Joseph Reif, Dom Hulak. Like, that is a very talented and long and athletic group of players. I mean, look, the most athletic of that group is not Boubacar. It's not Bryce Young. It's not Josh Burnham. It's Logan Thomas.
Yeah.
I mean, just from pure God-given athleticism, it's Logan Thomas. And, now, does that mean he's going to be a great player? No, it doesn't mean he's going to be a great player, but it just means that you're talking about tons of tools, Shaun. And I think that's what makes this a big year for Notre Dame. When I look at just, I don't even say that. I don't even want to say it's a big year for him for the defensive line. I'm just going to say this. I think it's a big year for Al Washington, who still is a little bit of that whipping boy kind of guy for Notre Dame fan base. Just is. I mean, he's that guy that things are going well. You made it to the title run, but we can't be too happy. We got to find somebody to be mad at about something. So let's make it him. So we'll go ahead and have him be that guy. And, to a degree, sometimes you understand it. Sometimes you're like, okay, now we're just kind of being a little ridiculous with some of the criticism. Like, it's fine to criticize a guy, but if you're also not willing to compliment him when things go well, then we've just turned him into a whipping boy, and it's not real criticism. But this is that year where those people either get proven correct about Al Washington, or he finally shuts up the doubters as a position coach. Recruiting thing, that's also important to this. In And we're going to talk about that in a minute. I'm going to call a little bit of an audible, Shaun. We're going to go right to recruiting next, just because the last couple segments have been so long. But this is a big year for him recruiting-wise. He's got to do well, but it's also a big year for him coaching-wise, because there are the question marks about, hey, because people in an attempt to kind of take away some of the credit from what Al Washington did this year will say, well, yeah, but those were Mike Elson's players. And that's true. They were Mike Elson's players. Now it's like, okay, you don't have a portal guy coming off the edge. You're going to have all homegrown guys. None of the guys playing defensive end this year were ever coached down by Mike Elston. Your defensive tackles have now primarily played for you, and you've got a couple portal guys. So if he can turn this into a big-time defensive line, then you got to say, okay, now you have nothing to point to as a developer. But he's got to counter that also with a really good recruiting class. And it is time that he puts that kind of together and says, hey, let's go get that class. But it's not just about him. It's also, y'all need to make sure from an NIL standpoint, because that's one position where you're quarterback and D-line are the two positions where you're seeing kids get overpaid for big time. And that's just the reality of it. So not that you need to overpay, but you need to be competitive enough and have a good enough a sales pitch that you can get a kid to maybe come for less, like Jeremiah Love did at running back. Dylan McCullough did a phenomenal job selling him on how Notre Dame can impact his life and all these different things, and they were competitive enough to where the sales pitch won. Now Washington's got to do a good job of that. Now, if he can answer both of those things, Shaun, then the narrative about him changes. But even more importantly, it means Notre Dame has a good enough defensive line to continue being dominant on defense. And that's the only place where I have it. Like, from a personnel standpoint, that's the only question mark I have. I love the talent, but it's got a lot to prove, just like we talked about with receiver and offensive line. The talent's there. As a matter of fact, Shaun, I think there's a very similar story along both lines for Notre Dame. And that ultimately is going to be the difference between Notre Dame being a 10-2 borderline playoff team and a team that's back in the title game or competing to be back in the title game. I'm actually not as worried about quarterback as long as they make the right decisions with who I think they should start. Others may disagree. That's fair. That's not the point of this. I think what's going to determine is how good of a job does Al Washington and Joe Rudolph do developing the talent that they have, because there's a lot of talent there. I mean, Al Washington is going to have a lot of 6'4 plus, 240, 250 plus, 35-inch plus arm length dudes on the edge next year. But can you coach them up? Can you get them to play to their potential? On the inside, is there a Riley Mills coming back next year? No. But Gabriel Rubio is a top 100 recruit. Jason Onye's talented. Jared Dawson's a proven player. Donovan Heinisch has shown that what he can be as part of rotation. Armel Mukam, like Ryan and I used to have this debate in the 23 class, who has the most upside? Is it Boubacar or Armel Mukam? Remember us having those debates, Shaun? But our debate was, I had one of them 1, he had one of them 2, and I had the other one 2, and he had the other one 1. We both had, and so did you, we both had Armel and Boubacar 1, 2 in our classes. I had Boubacar 1, Armel 2. Ryan had Armel 2, Boubacar 1. I believe you were with me. I think you had Boubacar 1 and Armel 2 as well from an upside standpoint. Well, coach that kid up, because if you have another Riley Mills on your roster, it's 88. That's who it is. It's him. It's Armel. And so coach him up. Coach up Devin Houston. Coach up Brennan Vernon. Like there's more talent than people realize up the middle. And you pointed that out too when we talked about with Marcus Freeman constantly praising the young D tackles on scout team. Well, now it's their time. Go coach them up. And you went and added 2 transfer guys. So depth of talent is not going to be an issue for the Notre Dame defensive line. It's all going to be about development. And same thing with the offensive line. And same thing with wide receiver. It's about development of talented young players. You've done a good job of bringing the talent in a lot of ways. Jared Dawson and Elijah Hughes, for example, didn't commit to Notre Dame in spite of Al Washington. Bryce Young, Logan Thomas, Boubacar, Armel, Chris Burgess, Joe Reif. These guys did not commit to Notre Dame in spite of Al Washington. Right? He's played a big role in it, but now you got to coach it up and shut everybody up. Same with Joe Rudolph. I got to shut that Brian Driscoll guy up about his criticism of me as an offensive line coach. Do it, coach. I want you to do it. That's going to make for a very fun year. Same thing without Washington. And I think the job those two guys do is ultimately what's going to determine how good this Notre Dame team can be in 2025 and beyond. Not a doubt in my mind. I know quarterback and all, but that's going to be the thing for me. And the difference with this D-line compared to past D-lines is this D-line isn't undersized like past D-lines. Donovan Hinish is the only small guy in the room right now. It's a very different looking defensive line. And I'll give you a little bit of an example here, Shaun. I'm going to pull up the depth chart here real quick. Pull up Notre Dame's roster. And here is the size of their interior defensive linemen coming into the season. Jared Dawson is 6'1", 302. Davion Dixon is 6'2", 322. Elijah Hughes is 6'3", 294. Let's see here. Donovan Hinish is the small guy, as I mentioned, at 278 in the rotation. Jason Onye is 6'5", 291. Sean Sevillano is 6'1", 320. Armel Mukum is 6'3", 302. Gabriel Rubio is 6'5", 316. Of the guys that we anticipate being in the battle for a rotation spot. It's like I didn't mention Devin Houston, who is 6'4", 297. He's not small. I didn't mention Cole Mullins and those kind of guys because they're on the outside looking in for right now. They're going to be much bigger than they were, where last year they had 285 or less guys in Howard Cross and Donovan Hinish. Now they got one guy under 290. That's it. And that's Donovan Hinish. If you look at the guys that we expect to be in the rotation, Jason Onye is your second smallest guy at 6'5", 291. Everybody else is 3 bills or higher of the guys we expect to be in the rotation, except maybe Elijah Hughes, who's 6'3", like 294, 295. So much bigger than they've been in recent years also. So it's a different, and they're all 6'4" plus on the edge. It's a different looking group. They're going to be a much better get off the bus looking defensive line this year than they have been in the past.
Yeah. I think at that position, I think there has to be somewhat of a relaxed mindset or more relaxed mindset from the fan base. Stop comparing Notre Dame in the interior to Alabama, schools that are literally in the heart of where those types of players are just born and bred. Just stop. You're never going to get that depth or that many in a class. But what you can do, and what Al Washington has developed as his blueprint, is to identify guys. You know, we're going to talk about recruiting, so I don't want to get into that. But he's identified guys that can transition, that played maybe on the outside or played a mixture in high school, but you can add weight, you can add muscle, and they can get in that 290 range and play really good football for you. Is that something that I would love for them to mix that with some guys, one or maybe 2 guys per class that are right there at 290 already or have played at that level? I think we didn't even mention, look, is Sean Sevillano going to be somebody that takes a step at that size?
Can Davion Dixon help you?
Can Davion Dixon help? Absolutely. That's something we need to watch as well, because those are the 2 guys that he's gone out in consecutive classes and gotten that have played at that size and have been, I guess, a typical nose tackle type of guy. I think Sean Sevillano is versatile and he can flip over and play both sides. Could you see on certain lineups Rubio and Sevillano in there at the same time?
Yeah.
You know, I think, you know, so
if you're playing like a team that wants to try to pound you, absolutely. Because
Absolutely.
Gabriel's played 3 technique at Notre Dame.
Yeah.
A bunch.
Yeah.
The thing is, Shaun, is like, I don't care if a guy is a stud who they had to convert from D-end. I don't care. Bryant Young got recruited to play linebacker at Notre Dame. He was 6'3", 240. He ended up being a 6'3", 300+ pound All-American at Notre Dame. I mean, not even talking about the Hall of Fame NFL career, just at Notre Dame, elite player. Chris Zorich was undersized. He was recruited to play linebacker. Riley Mills was recruited to play defensive end, started at defensive end in 2020. Was it 2022? 2021, he started a bunch of games at defensive end. And 2022, he started at defensive end, and then in the bowl game moved to D tackle and was really flipping good. I don't care about that. I care about, can you play at an elite level? I don't care what position you recruited to play. Cam Hart was recruited to play receiver. I don't care. Xavier Watts was recruited to play receiver. Did that make him less effective as a safety? No, it didn't. So, yes, it'd be nice to get those guys, but I don't care if what they recruited as. I care about, are you getting guys with high ceilings? That's what they have to do a better job of. And I don't know anyone that's going to argue that defensive line recruiting has been absolutely good enough to be championship team. It's not the case, in my opinion, especially at the middle. You have to really have superb development in that regard. But that's always going to be true at Notre Dame, because you're not in the South and you can't just get guys from 50 miles away to come play for you. It is harder. That's one position where it is harder for a host of reasons. But the reality is that Notre Dame can absolutely and should still have outstanding defensive lines. Their 2012 team had an elite defensive line. Their 2018 team had an elite defensive line. Their 2019 and 2020 teams had pretty darn good defensive lines. Not quite as good as 18, but they were still pretty good. Their 23 team had a pretty darn good defensive line outside of Viper. Their 24 team at stretches was disappointing early, but once they got rolling, was a pretty flipping good defensive line. That's the key, though. You have to take it to that next level. 2018 and 2012 needs to become more normal for Notre Dame, as opposed to but that's the exact same conversation we had about corner. So there were years where Notre Dame 2015, Notre Dame was really good at corner with Kavari Russell and Cole Luke. And then they weren't really that good again until 2018. And then they weren't really that good again until 2023. It's okay. It's got to be more consistent. And that's the challenge in front of Al Washington and Mike Martin and Marcus Freeman and Chris Ash and all those coaches is you've got to really have a high level of success from an evaluation standpoint. And you can't have misses on the recruiting trail. And that's going to be the key. So that's where this unit needs to get to, because that's the one position group that could potentially drag this team down from where they are right now, which is they are an elite defense. The gap is closed on defense. Can they maintain it? Or was it just a really nice couple year run and now they're going to kind of go back to being good, but not elite? That's the question. The D-line position will be key to that. And I'm looking forward to seeing what that unit's going to become this season. So, John, that's going to wrap it up for the defense. We're going to do a little bit of an audible because we're already 3 hours in. We are not going to promise you guys recruiting and then not talk recruiting. I feel like that would be really mean. We are going to skip the CFB part about who are those top teams. We'll talk about that again. We may either do that next Monday, or Shaun may do that next Monday with Trevor, or maybe we might get Shaun back for a segment later this week during one of the shows where we talk about that. So we'll skip that one, but we'll get to recruiting next. But before we do, folks, do me a favor, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell. We would greatly appreciate a 5-star review from you, whether you're listening via Spotify or Apple. We would love it if you could just take a minute of your time, give us that 5-star, give us a review of why you love the show. We would greatly appreciate that. And of course, as always, make sure you sign up for the message board at boards.irishbreakdown.com. We got some recruiting coming up next.